All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, it's kind of interesting because, we always talk about aesthetics, but today we're specifically looking at the aesthetics of our, environment.
Exactly. And this is really, I guess you could say kind of new in a way, because for so long, aesthetics was basically just like philosophy of art.
Yeah.
But by the end of the 20th century, this field of environmental aesthetics, it really began to emerge. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive, its roots and the debates and how it connects to environmentalism as a whole.
So we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on environmental aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's pretty comprehensive, lays out like the historical stuff, the modern views, given how this all connects to the whole, environmental movement.
Yeah, it's a great resource, really thorough. And so what we want to do today is give you, as a philosopher, like a solid understanding of environmental aesthetics. We'll look at like the key concepts, the debates that are still going on, and where it might be going, like what are the trends?
Right.
And then we'll also look at how some like classic philosophical ideas, stuff like disinterestedness or the sublime or the picturesque, how they've kind of been like, reinterpreted for this whole environmental context.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, we'll touch upon the connection to environmental ethics, which is a big one.
Right.
And the philosophical problems that come up when you're talking about aesthetics in the age of, what we call the Anthropocene, all this human impact.
Okay, well, let's start with like the historical roots of all this. And, as always, we're kind of interested in those philosophical like turning points. So it seems like the 18th century was a pretty big one in terms of how people saw and appreciated the world around them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The 18th century was a period of huge expansion, both in how people were actually experiencing their environment, but also how they were thinking about it theoretically.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
Before that, nature was often just like a backdrop in art, But then you start to see landscape emerge as its own thing, worthy of aesthetic consideration in itself. Think about landscape painting, artists like Claude Lorraine, that kind of thing. And then philosophically, there's this really important shift in how beauty itself was conceived.
Yeah, you're talking about the move away from beauty being tied up with like personal things, like love or possessions, and it became more objective.
Exactly. Philosophers started emphasizing what they call the disinterested character of aesthetic judgment. Like the idea was that you should evaluate the beauty of a thing or an experience not based on your own personal interest or religious beliefs or even its practical use, But the traditional ideas about beauty, order, harmony, proportion, those didn't quite fit with the new kinds of things people were finding attractive in nature.
Like those landscapes that were picturesque with all those subtle variations and irregular features, and then those really powerful, vast aspects of nature that led to the idea of the sublime, right?
Precisely. The picturesque, and Andrews really lays this out well, captured those scenes that had the same kind of aesthetic qualities as you'd find in Lorraine's paintings. Irregular compositions, lots of little details, a softer kind of color palette. And then the sublime, that comes from classical rhetoric originally, it was used to describe nature's like overwhelming power, its vastness, even its potential to, terrify. Think about like violent storms or the Alps. Those were shifting from being objects of fear to sources of fascination. So by the end of the 18th century, you have this really influential trio of aesthetic concepts: the beautiful, the sublime, and the picturesque.
Right.
Each one focused on different ways we engage with the natural world.
And of course, then you have Kant, who puts nature front and center in his whole philosophical system, at least in terms of aesthetic experience, right?
Absolutely. In the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant gives nature a really special place. For him, this whole idea of disinterestedness led him to focus on the formal elements of natural beauty, like the shape of a flower, rather than its biological purpose or any symbolic meaning. But he also develops a really sophisticated take on the sublime. He distinguishes between the dynamically sublime, that's how we experience nature's immense power, and the mathematically sublime, our experience of just like endless vastness.
Yeah.
And importantly, even with his emphasis on form, he sees natural beauty as even more important than artistic beauty. And he argues that there's this deep moral significance in how we experience nature's beauty and sublimity.
But it seems like even though Kant was all about natural beauty and the sublime, it was maybe the idea of the picturesque that really had the biggest impact on how people actually interacted with landscapes, right?
That's a really insightful point. Initially, picturesque just meant like in the style of a painting. But it really changed as people started connecting those artistic representations to how they saw actual landscapes. Like you had British aristocrats trying to make their estates look like those paintings by Lorraine,
Right, right.
putting so much emphasis on creating these perfect views. So picturesque came to mean like picture-like, and appreciating a landscape was all about experiencing the series of visual perspectives, almost like walking into a painting. It was judged mostly on composition and subject matter. And even though theorists like Richard Payne Knight and Uvedale Price tried to make the idea more nuanced, the popular understanding of the picturesque was all about how much nature looked like these idealized scenes. And that's what paved the way for scenic tourism, with writers like William Gilpin putting out guidebooks telling people where to go to find these picturesque spots.
Okay, so you have this, like, flourishing of nature aesthetics in the 18th century. What happens in the 19th century? Feels like the philosophical focus on nature kind of fades a bit.
You're right. After that initial burst of enthusiasm, the philosophical exploration of nature's aesthetic qualities does seem to decline. The intense interest in the picturesque and the sublime, it kind of wanes. Those terms almost become cliches. They even start to lose their distinctiveness, get all mixed up in how people use them. Like the Alps, they go from being this huge inspiration for the Romantics, the source of the sublime, to just being the backdrop for, like, mass tourism. And philosophically, a key figure after Kant, Hegel, he really favored art. For him, art was a more profound expression of absolute spirit, so it was implicitly above nature in terms of its aesthetic importance. So yeah, in the 19th century, especially in continental Europe and Britain, not as many thinkers were really focusing on the aesthetics of nature.
But, on the other side of the Atlantic, there's a totally different story unfolding, right? With how Americans were starting to view wilderness.
Exactly. At first, the American pioneers saw wilderness as something to be afraid of, Taming it was part of progress. But by the mid-19th century, as the wilderness was disappearing, people's views started to change. People like George Perkins Marsh were early voices warning about what would happen if we kept destroying nature without any thought for the consequences. And then you have philosophers like Emerson and Thoreau who had this really new idea that wilderness actually had its own value, something spiritual and inherent, something worth protecting for its own sake. And this shift in thinking is what ultimately leads to the first protected natural areas, places like Yellowstone and Yosemite, the national parks.
And it sounds like aesthetics played a big role in this, even if it was maybe in ways that we might question now.
Definitely. While, protecting Yellowstone and setting up the national parks might look like early examples of conservation, the main reason behind it was probably the desire to preserve those incredibly scenic landscapes. It was partly about national pride, showing that America had natural wonders just as grand as anything in Europe, or even grander.
Right.
And then there was the commercial side, too, with tourism developing as the railroads expanded. These natural wonders were often described as, like, nature's masterpieces, using artistic terms. And paintings of the American West, they were key in translating that beauty into a language that people already understood, the language of the picturesque, which came from Europe.
So the picturesque kind of lives on then, right? It becomes almost like this postcard view, especially as photography takes off and cars make travel easier. But were there any voices pushing back against this focus on just the scenic beauty of nature?
Oh, absolutely. Some early conservationists, they felt that the national parks, with their emphasis on scenery, were missing the point. They thought we should be focusing on understanding the ecology of a place, and that should be part of how we appreciate its beauty. John Muir is a great example of this. He really contrasted his own experiences in nature, which were deeply spiritual, but also grounded in his interest in things like geology, with how artists would just go out looking for pretty views, for something picturesque. And Muir also reinterpreted the idea of the sublime based on his own intense encounters with the American wilderness. This view, where ecology is important, led people like Muir to see the whole natural environment as beautiful, especially in its untouched state,
Right.
And they saw ugliness mainly in how humans were messing things up. And this is really where the idea of positive aesthetics starts to develop this perspective that values the wild and untouched over anything that humans have changed.
But it seems like all this emerging thinking about the beauty of nature wasn't really being picked up by mainstream philosophy in America or Britain, at least not at the time.
Unfortunately, that's true. There were some philosophers, people like George Santayana and John Dewey, who did touch on the aesthetics of landscape in their work, but it wasn't their main focus. They were mostly interested in the arts. And by the mid-20th century, especially in analytic philosophy, aesthetics was almost completely synonymous with the philosophy of art. Some textbooks even said that without art, there wouldn't be any aesthetics to talk about.
Wow.
Nature, because it wasn't designed by humans and existed outside of what they saw as culture, it was seen as a problem for real aesthetic appreciation.
So what changed?
Yeah.
What brought nature aesthetics back into the conversation as something worthwhile for philosophers to think about?
The real revival of interest in nature aesthetics happened in the 1960s. And it was driven by this growing awareness of environmental issues and the whole environmental movement. In a practical sense, you had laws being passed in the US and the UK that actually mentioned natural beauty. So there was a real need to figure out what that meant, how to even measure it for policy and regulations. And this led to ways of assessing the visual quality of landscapes.
Okay.
But from a pure philosophy point of view, the big turning point was this essay by Ronald Hepburn called Contemporary Aesthetics and the Neglect of Natural Beauty.
What was it about Hepburn's argument that was so influential?
He basically argued that analytic aesthetics had ignored nature, and that was a bad thing, and that appreciating nature wasn't just about applying the rules of art appreciation.
Right.
He said nature had its own unique qualities, so it needed its own way of being understood aesthetically. He made a distinction between a superficial appreciation of nature and a deeper, more meaningful one.
Yep.
And he said that deeper appreciation involved using all your senses, engaging with the environment in all its complexity. Basically, he was saying that nature is just as aesthetically rich as art, but we have to appreciate it on its own terms, not try to force it into the same categories.
It sounds like he was also critical of that, more superficial scenic aesthetic that's tied to tourism.
Yeah, definitely. He hinted at how things like mass tourism can make nature appreciation kind of trivial.
Right, yeah.
Just quick glances instead of real engagement. And then Alan Carlson took that critique further. He argued that this scenic aesthetic is based on a landscape model that basically sees nature as these flat pictures. It focuses on those romantic, picturesque images or just the formal visual aspects, and it ignores the deeper ecological realities. He also criticized those landscape assessment techniques, saying they were based on this flawed visual model.
So after Hepburn and Carlson, it became harder to argue that nature wasn't aesthetically interesting, but were there still people trying to defend that view?
There were some attempts to hold on to that idea, saying that because nature wasn't designed by humans, it couldn't really be appreciated aesthetically. But those arguments didn't really go anywhere, partly because, so many of our aesthetic experiences, the things that really move us, they involve nature,
Right.
like a sunset or the way birds fly. And also, there's this long-standing idea in aesthetics that anything you can look at aesthetically. So saying nature was completely off limits seemed really arbitrary.
Okay, so contemporary environmental aesthetics pretty much accepts that nature can be a source of aesthetic experience. But what are the big debates now? What are the main issues people are grappling with?
The debates are really about what that aesthetic appreciation of the environment actually is, what it means to appreciate nature. And a lot of the work that's been done since then builds on or reacts to the ideas of Alan Carlson and Arnold Berlin. We talked about Carlson already. He came up with the Natural Environmental Model, or NEM.
Right. Could you remind us, as philosophers, what the NEM is all about? How should it affect how we approach nature aesthetically?
Sure. The NEM basically says that to really appreciate nature, you need to understand what kind of environment it is. And the best way to do that is through science. Carlson compares it to appreciating art. Understanding art history and theory makes you appreciate a painting more. So knowing about geology, biology, ecology, that's what reveals the true beauty of nature.
Okay.
And then there's the ethical argument that goes along with this, which is that appreciating nature scientifically can make you care more about it and want to protect it.
Right.
But then you have Berlant, who has a completely different view with his aesthetics of engagement.
Yeah.
Berlant basically rejects the whole idea of being disinterested when you appreciate nature. He says that creates a distance between you and the environment and makes it feel alien. Instead, he emphasizes immersion, using all your senses, and understanding that nature is all connected. He sees the environment as a whole, not just a bunch of separate objects to be observed.
Yeah.
And he says we need to break down that barrier between us and nature to have a real aesthetic experience.
So you have these two very different approaches, and that's led to this way of classifying views in environmental aesthetics as either cognitive, like Carlson's NEM, or non-cognitive, like Berlin's aesthetics of engagement.
Exactly. And there are other terms too, like conceptual versus non-conceptual and
Yeah.
narrative versus ambient.
Right.
But they all boil down to this. Is knowledge essential for appreciating nature, or are there other things that are more important?
Right. Right. But it seems like that cognitive, non-cognitive split might be too simple, right?
Yeah, it can be a bit misleading. First of all, non-cognitive isn't quite right because even those approaches involve beliefs and judgments and interpretations. They just don't always put science first.
Right.
But more importantly, that distinction kind of limps two things together. What mental processes are involved in appreciating something aesthetically, and whether you absolutely need scientific knowledge to appreciate nature. A lot of theorists say that while science can enrich our appreciation, it's not like you can't have a meaningful experience of nature without it.
So what are some of the arguments against needing scientific knowledge to appreciate nature?
Well, some people say that the NEM, with its focus on science, mixes up facts about nature with aesthetic judgments, which are about value.
Okay.
Others say that requiring scientific knowledge goes against the idea of disinterestedness.
Right, yeah.
Some point out that science is so vast and always changing, it's impossible to know everything you need to know. And then there's the argument that focusing only on science limits what counts as a legitimate aesthetic experience, and it excludes a lot of valuable responses people have to nature.
Right, right.
Some even say that the objective, analytical way of thinking in science just doesn't fit with the subjective, experiential nature of aesthetic appreciation.
Okay.
And then there are those who say that science is just one valid way to appreciate nature, but there are others.
This brings up a big question then. If we don't need scientific knowledge to appreciate nature, then what are the rules?
Right.
How do we decide what counts as appropriate appreciation? Is it just anything goes?
That's the challenge. While some people might say it's all subjective and every response is equally valid, most philosophers working in this area are trying to find some other guidelines, some normative constraints for how we should engage with nature aesthetically.
Okay.
For example, Zangwill argues that when we appreciate an organic nature, it should be based on how it looks, its colors, shapes, textures.
Right.
Others say it's important to be aware of whether something is truly natural or if it's been made by humans.
Yeah.
Sato brings in a moral dimension, saying that we should appreciate nature in a way that respects its origins and processes. Hepburn focuses on how aesthetic experience can help us grow as people. Breedy talks about imagining well, using our imagination in response to nature. And Stecker even has this interesting idea of culpable error in belief as a way to judge whether someone's appreciation is inappropriate.
So these debates about what makes nature appreciation valid, they're kind of like the debates in art philosophy about whether there are right or wrong aesthetic judgments.
Exactly. Carlson's focus on science is similar to Hume's idea of the ideal critic in art. Someone with refined taste and lots of knowledge.
Right.
But just like people have questioned whether that's the best way to appreciate art, we can ask the same question about appreciating nature.
Right.
Should we be aiming for this broad scientific understanding of the whole natural world? Or is it also valuable to have those deep personal connections to specific places, even if we don't understand them scientifically?
We've been talking a lot about appreciating nature, but like we said before, environmental aesthetics has become much broader than that.
Yeah.
So how does it approach those environments that have been shaped by humans?
Right. So the initial focus was on those untouched natural places, which makes sense. But pretty quickly, the field realized that it needed to include those human-modified environments, those mixed environments where humans have had a big impact. And here again, Carlson and Berlin have different but both valuable perspectives. Berlin, from the beginning, applied his aesthetics of engagement to cities and other human-shaped environments.
Right.
He talks about the mutual fashioning of person and place, how people and the places they live in constantly shape each other. Carlson, on the other hand, taking his cue from the NM, says that to appreciate human environments, we need to draw on knowledge from social sciences and history.
Right.
To understand things like the purpose of buildings, the cultural significance of places, how cities have developed over time, that kind of thing.
And this naturally brings in the whole idea of cultural landscapes and sense of place.
Exactly. When we talk about human environments, we have to consider the aesthetic value of cultural traditions and how important a sense of place is to people's identity, history, and culture.
Hmm.
Things like local folklore, myths, religious beliefs, historical narratives, they can all enrich our aesthetic experience of the places we live in and shape, and they contribute to that strong sense of place.
Are there any specific kinds of human-modified environments that have gotten a lot of attention from philosophers?
Oh, definitely. The urban landscape is a big one, thinking about the unique beauty and challenges of cities.
Right.
And then, interestingly, industrial and post-industrial sites, places that people usually see as ugly, they've also become interesting. They're seen as like modern ruins, evoking the picturesque or even the sublime. They
Interesting.
make us think about history, decay, the power of industry, all that. But maybe the most philosophically rich and well-studied type of human environment is the garden. It has such deep roots in history and culture with all sorts of symbolic meanings across different traditions.
Yeah.
And it's so clearly a blend of nature and human intention. Philosophers have looked at everything from contemporary gardening practices to specific types of gardens, like Japanese gardens or botanical gardens. And then there's the whole aesthetic of rural landscapes and farmland.
What about environmental art? Those big art installations that are put into natural or urban environments, where do they fit in?
Environmental art, because it interacts directly with the environment, brings up some really fascinating questions about the relationship between nature and culture. Some people see those interventions as damaging to nature, aesthetically speaking,
Right.
while others say they can raise awareness about the environment, make us think critically about our relationship with it, or even make a place more beautiful. And then there are restored environments and rewilding projects, which bring up all sorts of aesthetic, ontological questions about what something is and ethical questions. And then, of course, we have those new, unpredictable environments that are being created by climate change.
Right.
They challenge our existing categories and ways of thinking about aesthetics.
And this leads us to the connection between environmental aesthetics and environmentalism as a whole. It seems like this idea of aesthetic protectionism, protecting nature because it's beautiful, that's been a motivating factor in conservation for a long time.
Absolutely. That idea that nature's beauty is a reason to protect it, it's a powerful one. And it has definitely motivated conservation efforts, like the national parks you talked about. It's a really appealing way to justify protecting nature. But philosophically, there are some complications, and it's been debated quite a bit.
What are some of the problems with using aesthetic protectionism as the main reason for protecting the environment?
One issue is that preserving beauty can clash with keeping an environment ecologically healthy. Like if you manage vegetation to create a pretty view, you might disrupt the natural processes. Another concern is that focusing on beauty can lead to more tourism and recreation, which can actually damage those places.
Right.
And then there's the criticism that aesthetic protectionism can be too selective. It might only protect the most conventionally beautiful landscapes and animals, the ones that people are drawn to, and neglect other parts of the environment that are less pretty but maybe more important ecologically. And then, kind of ironically, you can have situations where aesthetic arguments are used against environmental policies, like when people object to the look of wind farms.
Right.
So yeah, it makes you wonder, can aesthetic values actually conflict with what's best for the environment?
It sounds like that scenic aesthetic we talked about earlier, it comes under fire a lot in this context.
Exactly. People say it's too focused on visual appeal and human-centered values, and it doesn't really appreciate the intrinsic worth and complexity of nature. And this is where positive aesthetics comes in.
Remind me what positive aesthetics is all about and how it addresses those problems with aesthetic protectionism.
So positive aesthetics basically says that all of nature is aesthetically good, or even beautiful if you understand it properly. And a lot of times this is linked to the idea that scientific understanding is the key to that appreciation.
Okay.
The implication is that no part of nature is inherently ugly or not worth protecting.
But how do philosophers justify saying that all of nature is beautiful? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
There are different arguments. Carlson says that science helps us see the order and complexity and functionality in nature, and that's what we appreciate aesthetically. Saito says that even the seemingly boring or ugly things in nature become interesting when you understand their history and their role in the ecosystem.
Right.
Others say that it doesn't make sense to call inorganic things ugly because they don't have a purpose in the same way that living things do. Or they emphasize how even species that seem ugly play a role in the web of life.
But positive aesthetics has gotten some criticism too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Some say that if everything is beautiful, then we can't compare things aesthetically, which we need to do when making decisions about the environment.
Right.
Others find the whole idea that all nature is beautiful to be strange or hard to justify. And some say that it relies on outdated ideas about ecology.
Okay, so finally, let's talk about aesthetic value and biodiversity. This seems like a really important issue for environmentalism, especially now.
It is. Aesthetic protection might focus on saving what's beautiful, but a big part of modern environmentalism is about protecting biodiversity, preventing species from going extinct.
Yeah.
And those two goals can be different, even conflicting. Someone who only cares about beauty might want to protect a visually stunning species that's common, even if it means losing a less attractive species that's endangered and crucial to the ecosystem.
Right.
And most environmentalists would say that's a bad choice.
So have philosophers looked at whether there might be a deeper connection between aesthetic value and biodiversity instead of treating them as separate things?
Yeah, some have. One idea is that biodiversity is like rarity in art. Rare species are more valuable aesthetically because they're scarce.
Okay.
That's been criticized. And then there's Welchman, who argues that biodiversity is good because it gives humans a richer aesthetic life.
Yeah.
And he says the government should protect biodiversity for that reason. These discussions also highlight the political side of things. How laws like the National Monuments designation can reflect this idea of protecting nature for its beauty.
Right.
And all this happens within a complex legal and social landscape.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how environmental aesthetics has developed historically, looked at those debates about how we should appreciate nature, considered how it applies to human-made environments, and explored the links to environmental ethics and the challenges of climate change. What are some of the big questions that you, as a philosopher, are left with after all this?
Well, considering all these different philosophical perspectives and the way we value or don't value the environment, it makes you wonder, how should our ethical theories change to account for this complex aesthetic relationship we have with the world around us? And in this time of such drastic environmental change, what role does philosophy, specifically thinking about aesthetics, play in shaping our values and our actions?
Those are some really important questions to consider, definitely. And we encourage everyone to explore those sources we mentioned and see where this field goes next, this deep dive, you know, it's just a starting point, a way into this really interesting and increasingly important area of philosophy.